I have to go back over 50 years to when I was 14 and I led a walkout at school for the right for the girls to wear trousers. So I've been being a nuisance for that long. I've done all sorts of things, non-violent direct action, being part of big organisations like CND and doing those massive marches, blockades at Greenham, making speeches, you name it, and also an attempt at doing things with my own MP, parliamentary lobbying, all of those sorts of things. And I know from those of you who have got in touch that there's a really wide range of people here watching this tonight who are involved in a lot of different campaigns. And one of the things we all have in common is that we want to make change. And the question is, given that the government of the day makes decisions from the top down that affect all of us, how can we best influence them? And I was very fortunate in 2023, Lesbian Labour, LGB Alliance and the Gay Men's Network had come together and put on a meeting called Labour Get Braver. And we were trying to convince Labour to actually speak out about lesbian, gay, bisexual rights. And at that meeting was the wonderful George McGregor, who spoke out at the time and said he'd be happy to help us move forward with that agenda that many of us are active in. And finally, I've spoken to somebody who knows how to do the parliamentary government lobbying. And I thought, well, I can't keep him to myself, although I would like him in my cupboard so I can wheel him out when I need some advice. He's on the end of a phone and email. But tonight, we've put this webinar together so that you can also learn from George's experience. And I'm going to hand over to George and he'll tell you all about himself. And by the end of the night, we'll all know a lot more about how to effectively lobby. So George, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Paula. As you say, I've spent the last 20 years working as a professional public affairs advisor. And what does that mean? That means I've spent my working life advising clients, public sector clients and private sector clients, on how to effectively engage with governments and with parliaments to achieve whatever objectives they may be trying to achieve. Just to give you a flavour of some of the companies that I've worked with, I've worked with John Lewis and Waitrose on retail issues. I've advised Jet2, the airline, on transport issues, Expedia on tourism issues, Coca-Cola on soft drinks, Budweiser on alcohol, you name it, I've done it. Some of the public sector companies I've worked with or organisations are the Met Office, an amazing client down in Exeter, and I work with the Sue Ryder campaign. So public and private sector, and all the time I've been working with them to try and help them achieve their objectives. But before I started working in public affairs, and I spent 10 years as a director and then 10 years as managing director of one of the UK's largest public affairs consultancies, so I ran the business. I worked in government in the last Labour government, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown government, when I was a special advisor in the Secretary of State for Scotland. And before that, I worked for a trade union for a decade, for Unison, in the 1990s. I know it's a controversial trade union at the moment, but for many years it has fought ferociously for protecting workers' rights, and I'm proud of my time in Unison in the 90s. And my final thing I would say in my introduction is that I'm a gay man. I've been with my lovely partner Raymond for 27 years. 11 of those years we've been in a civil partnership. I'm gender critical. I've been to numerous LGBT Alliance conferences, and I've recently been persuaded to join up with a new steering group, a campaign called Labour LGB. So that's a couple of minutes on me, Paula.
Jolly good. So if we could have the first slide up, Di, please. We've got Di in the background doing all this, the technical stuff. And so the way we're going to do it tonight, we're going to look at the why, who, what and how of lobbying. And at the end of each section, I'll have a little bit of time with George to tease out some of those threads. And then please, as we're going along, make a note of questions that you've got, and we'll take them all together at the end when we've finished. So over to you, George, with the why of lobbying.
Okay, we're starting at the beginning. Go on to the next slide, please. We're starting with the beginning. Why on earth would you undertake a lobbying campaign? And, over the 30, 40 years I've been doing this kind of thing, it's amazing how many people just dive straight into it. They get angry about a subject and they think something must be done, and they just think, what are we going to do? We're going to write to an MP, we're going to write to the minister, we're going to set up a website, we're going to hold a meeting. And they just dive straight into it. And it's not just individuals that do that, it's companies. So some of the biggest companies I work with, the chief executive may say, this is terrible. I've read something in the paper, something must be done. And then they send off their team to get something done. And what we always advise anybody before they go into a public affairs campaign is to work out precisely what is it you're trying to achieve. Precisely what is it you're trying to achieve. Because with the clients I've worked with, sometimes it's a legislative objective that they have. So they're trying to change a law or to stop a law. And that's really what most people think lobbying is about. But it's only a small part, because sometimes clients have got a fiscal objective. They might be trying to stop a tax, that's being proposed by a government. Sometimes they have a reputational objective. They may have a bad reputation because of something in the press, and they want to fix that with stakeholders. Or they may have a crisis. I once worked for a helicopter company, and their helicopter crashed on a Friday night and tragically killed 10 people, including 7 people in a pub in Glasgow. And then suddenly you're working with the client to engage in a crisis situation. And other times it may be a financial thing, a deal. So you need to work out what is the client trying to achieve. And only when you've worked out, well, what is it we're trying to achieve, then you think about, well, what's the strategy to achieve that? And it may be political pressure, but it may not. It may be persuasion, or it may be evidence. The government is lacking evidence in a particular subject. So you need to work out, well, what's the strategy that we need to undertake in order to promote a public affairs campaign. And only then, once you've worked out the aim and worked out the strategy, then you come to, well, what actions are required? And that's where you pull together a plan of action. What is it that you want to do? What's the timetable for doing that? What are the deliverables? And then as the campaign progresses over time and you want to timetable your activity, you work out, well, you measure, you say, are we achieving what we set out? In any campaign, I really would encourage discipline. I'm in a campaign at the moment, and it's a new campaign. And what I'm trying to do is impose a degree of discipline. I don't mean a kind of iron fist, this must be done. I mean, we've set out our plan, let's stick to the plan. It's too easy in the heat of a campaign to think, oh, maybe we should go down this road. And it's easy to go down that road, but you may be using vital resource, labour, time, or time engaging with stakeholders that's actually wasted. Stick with what you're trying to achieve. That doesn't mean you should rule out opportunism and seizing an opportunity, but you should only deviate from the plan after careful thought and consideration. So we're beginning at the beginning, planning. If you have effective planning, you're much more likely to have an outcome that you desire.
Right. And it's interesting that, because I've noticed those of us that are involved in fighting for, for instance, clarifying the meaning of sex, because that will impact on sexual orientation, sticking to that narrow pathway when there's all hell breaking loose. 1 minute you're off down the, like the Sandy Peggy thing at the moment. Obviously, that impacts on our main aim, but it's so easy to be reactive in these times, especially with social media, and it pulls you off what you were doing, instead of saying, well, that's all happening, but someone else is dealing with that. We're going to steer through and stick to the plan. So
I would concur
yeah.
with that, Paula, and I would also say, I mentioned I was part of the Labour LGB steering group. We've just launched an X, a Twitter handle. And one of the things we agreed at the beginning was not to be diverted from any vile, kind of tweets that you would see in response, and to
Yeah,
stick with very much what we're trying to
exactly.
achieve. So you're right
Yeah,
about that discipline. I would agree with what you say.
yeah. So take us to the who, because for many of us, that's the key issue. Are we talking to the right person? And if not, how do we find the right person?
The over 20 years doing this job, the number of times a client, and I mean a big, sophisticated private sector company, has come to me and said, George, what we need to happen is we need to meet the minister. We need to meet the minister. And I've had to say to the client, well, just getting a meeting with the minister is not necessarily going to solve your problem, because so much else has to happen. Your warm words are not going to solve your problem. And similarly, I've come across individuals who think, well, we need to write to the MP and write to the minister, and they think we're going to change something. Well, that's not how it works either. So that mistake is a common mistake. And the advice I would give any campaign in that planning stage is to think very carefully about who are the stakeholders that really matter. And what I've done on this slide is break down a whole series of different stakeholders that you might want to think about for your campaign. Every campaign's different, so therefore every stakeholder batch will be different. I've put at the top ministers. They take the decisions. They're the most obvious people you might think about. But don't just think about the Secretary of State. And in a following slide, you'll see that I break down some of the stakeholders in the health department. Now, Wes Streeting is the obvious person you might want to write to, but actually, Gilly Merrin on the gender issue, she's got day-to-day responsibility. So she's probably thinking just as much about this issue as Wes Streeting. So, think about the ministers and who the junior ministers are. Think about it very carefully, because you may decide to go to the junior ministers in the first instance rather than to the Secretary of State, who's incredibly busy and it's very difficult to get traction. Each Secretary of State's got 2 to 4 special advisors. Now, that's the job I used to do in government. That's a political appointee, so the Secretary of State gets to make a very small number of political appointments, and these are key people who the minister will listen to very carefully and spend a lot of time with. I often joked that my time in the Scotland office, I spent more time speaking to the Secretary of State for Scotland than I did to my husband Raymond, simply because you spend all your time with the minister and it's such a demanding job. And that, for a lobbyist, is an opportunity, because you can get messages right into the minister without going through the civil service. And that brings me to the third category, civil servants. For every single policy issue, there's a whole batch of civil servants, some very senior, some at mid-level, and some junior. And I always see it as one of my tasks in a public affairs assignment is to work out, well, who are the officials and how do we get onto their radar? How do we get a meeting? How can we communicate our messages? How do we build up a rapport? I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The opposition front bench is critical. Some of my clients in the private sector take the view, well, oh, Labour's got a majority of almost 200. We just need to speak to Labour. The opposition, they're irrelevant for the next 5 years. Completely the opposite is true. The Conservative, the SNP, the Lib Dem, even the Reform on occasion MPs can be useful in any campaign. Because if you're trying to get leverage with the government, these opposition spokespeople get time in Parliament to ask questions, oral questions, written questions, to initiate debates even. So they can be, and if there's a bill going through the House of Commons, they get to table amendments. And okay, they may not win a majority, but they've got a voice and they can be heard and they can build alliances. MPs, parliamentarians, don't forget about, we've talked about MPs, but don't forget about the Lords. The Lords can be very useful. And I've come across many Lords who will table amendments during the course of legislation. So you want to map out which Lords are important. And because I'm Scottish, I'm very focused on the really important institutions in our devolved nations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But of course, the regional mayors are also important. I put on here APPGs. Now, that's all party parliamentary groups. Let me take a sip. What is that? Well, that is what it says on the tin. That is a group of parliamentarians from all political parties, and there are dozens of all party groups. And they can be very useful. They can have inquiries in Parliament, informal inquiries. They can publish informal reports. They can put out press releases. They can summon ministers to answer questions. And when used effectively, APPGs are very useful devices indeed. And influencers. And by influencers, I don't mean the people on Twitter who get paid £10,000 to promote a couch or some clothing. I'm talking about think tanks in a space, or journalists, or people who are active in social media. Sometimes these people have the ears of ministers or officials or MPs. So we sometimes call it, the Americans call it an eye-to-eye strategy, an influence the influencer strategy. And we very often deployed that in any campaign. So that's gives you a flavour of some of the kinds of stakeholders. There are others. I like trade unions and business groups, but there are others. But that gives you a flavour of some of the groups. If you go on to the next slide, and I want to apologise for this slide because it's a bit messy. It's not my proudest slide on PowerPoint. But what I did, I've got access to something called the Civil Service Yearbook. It's an online publication. And I did a very quick and dirty analysis of some of the stakeholders. And I put in keyword searches such as LGBT, because that's what the government call it, gender. I put in gender. I put in the curriculum because, curriculum issues are important. And I put in health. So just did a quick and dirty. And literally in about 15 minutes, I got the names, the phone numbers, the emails of everybody who just popped up. And that was people who are ministers, people who are private secretaries to ministers, people who are special advisors to ministers, parliamentary private secretaries who are MPs who represent the minister in Parliament, as well as the officials at senior level and more junior level. And I managed to kind of mass all of that. I dumped it into a Word document. So that was like 12 pages of names and phone numbers and responsibilities of what they did. And then I put this very clumsily into a slide. But you'll get here, on the gender issue and sex and gender issue, we all know about Annalise Dodds. She's the kind of poster child of the government's policy. But I'm not sure many people will have come across Leah Shearer or her special advisor, Scott and Kieran, or some of you will have come across Nia Griffith. But remember, I talked about having both Secretary of State ministers and junior ministers. Well, Nia has got the responsibility for LGBTQ plus policy as a junior minister. And I think if you were to do a stakeholder mapping, that's somebody you want to engage with and you want to have a meeting with and you want to get on our radar and you want to have a strategy around, because she's just as important. She's thinking about it every single day, whereas Annalise Dodds also has responsibilities within the Foreign Office. And there are some of the officials. Marcus and Anna are some of the officials. And again, I think I managed to get their email addresses, and you should never be fearful of approaching these people. On the next slide, and this is just as an illustration of the kind of thing you could do. These are some of the people in health and education. I don't have the time to go through all of these people individually, but it gives you a flavour of the kind of way that a public affairs consultancy would map out stakeholders. And you know what? We would do all of this before we even initiated our campaign. So a lot of that preparation work. So I'll stop there,
Right.
just to take a breath and to get a little
Jolly
drink of
good. So if we go back, we'll go to the next slide, Di, because that was that's right. So a couple of questions about this. You obviously, the Civil Service Yearbook, is that something you had to pay for? I mean, how do we as punters get hold of that information, because some of us have worked out the names, like, Baroness Merron had come across my radar, but
Yeah.
finding the right email is always difficult. Is that the place to look, and how do we get access to that?
Well, unfortunately, it is you do have to pay for it, but the fortunately, that's the unfortunate. The fortunately is I've got access to it. So and at the end of this session, we're going to ping up my email address. So if anybody wanted me to do a little bit of digging, then I'm happy to do that.
Okay, brilliant. Because obviously we can all find our MPs. That's neither here nor there. The other thing I would say is actually about I think that'll come up into the what actually. I'll hold off on that question. But yeah, that is really useful, because like you say, most of us have got an idea, but all of these, the way that broke down into a junior minister, and Nia Griffiths just made that speech during
She did.
LBGT. She kept getting it wrong.
Mhm.
So if it's her job, I think she maybe needs to practice her nonsense alphabet. Excuse me, but it's very easy to think go to the top, isn't it? And in fact, it's about knowing where to press the levers.
Yeah,
Who
I
is the
would
right
I would
person?
emphasize, sorry, Paul, I would emphasize that, when I put up a list like this, it's easy to be overwhelmed and think, oh my God. But I put up the list just to illustrate the kinds of stakeholders that are important.
Yeah,
And your campaign needs to make a judgment as to
yeah,
who matters to who. And you need to slim
exactly.
that down and make it manageable.
Yeah. So when we've found out, we know what we're doing, we know what we're aiming at. We've found somebody that we need to be in conversation with. So let's go on to the what now then. What should we be doing with them?
Yeah, so the what is, well, what do you say? What is your messaging? And
Yeah,
again, working in the commercial sector, a lot of campaigns, they do all this work up front, even before they have any conversation with any political stakeholder. And I often think, well, where is the most important place to begin? And that is in the evidence base. Ministers will say that we've got evidence-based policy making. Civil servants will say we've got evidence-based policy making. We know it's not always true because there is values-based policy making, but ministers will say that. And I do think you got to do your homework on a particular issue, whatever the issue. We're focusing here on sex and gender, but whatever, then luckily on that we have the cash report. But the you've got to get your evidence together, whatever the campaign, and get your facts together. And when you get your facts together, you need to think about crystallizing that into crisp, clear messages. Not long paragraphs with long academic, statements, but crisp, clear messages that you use throughout your communication, either in letters to ministers and communication emails to civil servants or in your social media even. Keep it very simple. You may wish to adapt it to your audience. So, if you're writing, I've got a Scottish accent, if you're writing to a SNP member of Parliament, clearly you can't just send the letter. Then if you're sending it to a kind of Tory MP in the southeast of England, you need to adapt what your messages are. I wrote a letter this morning to Anas Sarwar, who's the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, and of course I set it in the context of Scottish politics and what's been happening over the past few days. I was up in Glasgow at the weekend at the conference, and I said hello to him, and over the past few weeks. So keep it very, tailor it to your audience. You need to, if you can, test your messages, what works and what doesn't. Sometimes we've used specific messages with government and or with an MP, and we've had a kickback. And we found that, oh no, that's not gone down very well. That's got a very bad reaction. So we adapt our messages. It doesn't mean you rip up your messages, it means you tweak them just to get the maximum impact. But you should try and stay disciplined. If you've what private companies do is they'll have a page or two of key messages that they want to get across, and then they'll have a question and answer document, a Q&A document, where they think of the tricky questions that stakeholders may ask and they think of answers. So you're not busking it in a meeting, but you're thinking about carefully in advance. So messaging is absolutely key. We would, if the previous segment was about stakeholder engagement, I would call this message development, to use some of the jargon we use
Jargon,
in
yeah.
the industry.
Okay, so I'm thinking about how long it took us. For instance, with Lesbian Labour, we managed to get our demands down to 5.
Yeah,
And they were none of them were more than one sentence, and in
that's
fact,
good.
repeating the clarify sex to clarify sexual orientation was, was that short, and it it's quite short and pithy and leads to a conversation. What do you mean by that? Because that's the other thing, is your messaging can be an opener, can't it, to just or an earworm. I mean, as a as a playwright, which is one of the things I do, find or songwriting, you find a set of words that actually keep repeating. But I'm aware that's useful. Short, sharp messages, crisp, clear messages for social media is different to short, sharp messages to an MP. Is there a different language?
Yes, I thank you for drawing that distinction. What I'm not advocating is that every communication to the civil service, say, or to a minister needs to be like, what did Dominic Cummings say? Take back control and get Brexit done.
Yeah,
If you speak in slogans, you won't get anywhere.
yeah,
But what I'm talking about in messaging is have your argument well crafted. Make your argument simple to understand. And of course,
yes,
you're allowed to use long sentences and develop arguments, especially in communications which are not just social media.
yeah, very important. Okay, so how? Let's go on to that then.
So, Paula, what we're going to do now is just give you a few tips on engaging with some of the categories of stakeholders and a few observations from all the many years I've been at this game. And I'm going to start with MPs because I think most people will have at some stage on this call sought to engage either with their local MP or with a group of MPs, or indeed have emailed every MP. I've certainly done that in the past. And I think the key thing with engaging with MPs is to begin by establishing your credentials. Most MPs won't reply if you're a if you're a local constituent. I live in Lewisham North. My MP is Vicky Foxcroft. If I was going to write to Vicky, I'd put my name, my address, and my phone number on it. And if you don't put your name, your address, and your phone number, the MP's office will either ignore it or they'll write back and say, "Are you a local constituent? What's your address?" So you need to, establish your credentials, whatever they may be. And it may be as a constituent, or it may be representing lesbian Labour, or you know, the WWF, whatever organization you represent, explain who it is, and then you get your credentials. Always tell a story. It's not just, I'm writing to complain about this piece of legislation. Literally MPs get hundreds of emails every day, literally. And if it's just a standard email, it's more likely to be ignored or to get a standard reply. So try and tell your story to make an impact. Most MPs get their staff to read the emails and respond. But some MPs are addicted to their phones and may even see it themselves and respond. So tell a story, make a connection. Always have an ask. Don't just say, that you're angry. Ask them to do something. Keep it brief. We talked about that before. I really would encourage people to visit MPs' surgeries. MPs have regular surgeries. Sometimes they're in person, physical, and sometimes they're online. If you're confident enough, speak to MPs. Are just human beings too, and you can, just as you and I, Paul, are having a conversation, you can have a conversation with your MP, and don't be scared. Think about what an MP can get out of any engagement. Most MPs I know will want to, if it's a friendly meeting, will want to take a photograph and then shove it up on social media because they want to show they're out and about in their community, visiting projects, meeting with the voters, and they're as hungry for content on their social media as others are. They are incredibly busy. Please never be rude to MPs. It's not, you're in it for the long game with a member of parliament. Even if you profoundly disagree with them, keep it courteous, keep it polite, keep it reasonable, and try and win them over. You never know. Civil servants. Again, it amazes me how many clients I've worked with in the last 20 years are quite nervous about engaging with civil servants. Whereas the reality is that civil servants want to engage with credible organizations who've got something to say, because they need to engage with organizations so they don't make mistakes and they get it right. And I've always sought to nurture relations with civil servants. I had a phone call this morning, 11 o'clock. Civil servant just phoned me out of the blue, not arranged, use the old telephone, the old-fashioned way. No pre-arranged appointments. And he wanted my advice on something. And I gave my advice and we had a good conversation. And then I got two other emails from civil servants later on today. They were asking for my client's help on something that they're trying to achieve. So what I'm doing is I'm not just engaging with the civil servants, but I'm helping the civil servants do their
Do their
job.
job. Mm.
Yeah, and I think before you engage with the civil servants, back to that point about evidence, civil servants are always hungry for evidence. Let's have to take another wee sip. And if you can provide that evidence, then you are helping them do their job and helping them to give informed advice to ministers. I spoke a bit earlier about working with ministers and shadow ministers. I think the key with ministers is to work out how you can help them. Ministers are really busy. They've got 1,000 things to do. And if you can frame your conversation with them as, how can we help you achieve your objectives? You're much more likely to get a meeting in the first place, and it's much more likely to be a successful meeting. I'll give you another top tip. I'm doing a lot of talking in this meeting because that's the way it's structured. But the worst thing you could do if you get a meeting with a minister and indeed an MP is to do all the talking. But I've had clients who've got half an hour with a minister. They know they've got half an hour. And despite my coaching at the beginning of the meeting, they've just gone in and they've just done all the talking. And literally, you're getting to 25 past the hour, 26 minutes, and thinking, you've not actually let the bloody minister say anything, And it's such a fundamental mistake. And I'll tell you why, because if you're trying to change somebody's mind about something, you need to work out, well, what's on their mind? What are their concerns? How can I reassure the minister on their concerns? How can I provide evidence to counterbalance the evidence they may already have been presented to by someone like Stonewall? So how can you provide the counterbalance? So I think the more that you can have and this is just as an important lesson with MPs, listening to a minister and listening to an MP and putting them on the spot and asking questions. Well, what's the process? What's going to happen next? What's your concerns? Do you perceive there being political problems? Then you can go away from that meeting and recalibrate your own campaign to help you achieve your objective. So, working with ministers is terribly important. Never be rude and try and build a relationship. That's absolutely key, and you're in it for the long term. One of the ministers I first started working with over 20 years ago is still kicking around the House of Commons and still asking questions about the same subject area. And we've had that relationship for over 20 years. Special advisors, I spoke about SPADs they're called before. Really, really important. But you should only really use a special advisor when you have to do so. So is something really important? Is it an issue in the press? Is it of controversy? Does it have a political dimension that the minister needs to deal with? You can, if you've got a relationship with a special advisor, you don't want to burn it by wasting their time. So I know lots of special advisors. When Labour LGB launched, we wrote to a Secretary of State. I won't say which department, but we wrote to a Secretary of State. And I knew that if you just write to the Secretary of State's email address, you'll get a reply in a month's time from a civil servant. So I cut through that and I sent a copy of that letter to the special advisor in the department. And I said, could you bring this to the Secretary of State's attention as a way to kind of cut through the civil service machine and really get on the radar of the Secretary of State. So they're important, really important. I mentioned earlier about the influence, the eye to eye strategy, the influencer to influencer strategy. And quite a lot of ministers and civil servants used to work at think tanks, or they may have their favorite think tank that they speak at regularly. And if you do your research, or they may be very close to journalists. And I think if you can work out who's in the sphere of influence of ministers, you can work out how to get the ear of the minister. It's just another way of, and we've run lobbying campaigns targeting journalists in the past, or partnering with think tanks just as an attempt to get on the radar of ministers you're trying to influence. Coalition building, this is a really important one. Who else shares your aims? And who could you potentially work with? And how could you creatively build a coalition? Now, I worked on a campaign which lasted for 5 years with a client who wanted to regulate gambling in the UK. So they wanted to reduce the amount you could bet in a gaming machine in a betting shop. Previously, with fixed odd betting terminals, you could bet, amazingly, £100 a spin every 20 seconds in every high street of the country. And it was resulting in horrendous problems with problem gambling. So we built a coalition with parts of the gambling industry who just could see that this was contaminating every other part of the industry, and they campaigned for a reduction in the stake from £100 to £2. And we built a coalition. We built a coalition with MPs. We worked with journalists in the Daily Mail, not my favourite newspaper, but they were on our side in that campaign, and the Telegraph. Again, not my favourite newspaper, but they were on our side in that campaign. And we built an alliance with the churches. And I'll never forget when just before the end of the campaign, before it succeeded, and we eventually succeeded, we got a tweet from the Archbishop of Canterbury, which we negotiated over a number of weeks. And it wasn't just any old tweet. It was his Christmas message tweet. And I just thought, this is the most extraordinary. We're in coalition with the Church of England, along with parts of the gambling industry, along with MPs and the right-wing press. And I thought, blimey. And that's why, in the end, that coalition just became so powerful. The then Conservative government just said, we've got to move on this issue. And they eventually, after a huge amount of pressure, reduced the stake to £2. So that's just some top tips
Brilliant.
that I wanted to convey, because I know we want to leave some
Bang.
time for questions.
Yeah, it's bang on time there. So just unpacking a bit of what you've said there. One of the things I know has frustrated a lot of us is that when you try and send a letter to an MP who has got, is in one of the departments, but he or she is not your constituency MP. Again, a lot of people are sending those emails and then they get no response, or they get, you're not a constituent. And
Yes.
it's amazing how many people, even, within the party, your political party, whichever it is, don't know how to get around that. It's and that should be more in the public domain, shouldn't it? That, if somebody's not just a constituency MP, but they're also a junior minister in the health department, where is it best to write to them?
Well, Paula, if you want to write to a minister or a junior minister, the wrong place to write to them is at their House of Commons email. So that's the email that ends, I think it's at parliament.uk.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're writing to them there, it's a mistake,
Yeah.
because you're then relying on their parliamentary researcher to diligently send it across to whichever department you're trying to connect with. on that occasion, you should be writing to the minister directly at his or her department, and you should be copying that into his or her private secretary just to make sure it's received. And if appropriate, I would copy it to special advisors, but remember I said not to overuse the
Yeah,
special advisors. So that's what I would recommend. The worst thing to do is to send it to the parliament.uk
yeah.
website,
And
because
where,
you're wasting your time drafting the email.
yeah, and again, are those addresses only available through the Civil Service Yearbook? Or
No, not at all. No, some of the departments do publicise where to write to ministers. But what you tend to find is that they're very generic email addresses. So it might be ministers at the department at health.gov.uk. What or if you're lucky, you'll get the Gilly Merrin, the Barness Merrin. You might get PS Merrin at dh.gov.uk. So you need to do a bit of research online before, but there is always the Civil Service Yearbook. There's no what's the word, silver bullet to this. You just need to work hard and diligently kind of research as
Well,
best as you
the
possibly
research
can.
is fine, but you need to be researching in the right place. And I know that on this issue, there's so much frustration right the way across the movement. The number of letters that have been written, and also that being filtered out by staffers.
Yeah.
We know that the influencers that you're talking about, there's also the malign influencers, which are those who have an ideological position opposed to your campaign. And whether it's paranoia or not, the suspicion that reading any of these emails, they don't have to bring it to the attention of their boss. They can just ditch it. And there's enough unanswered emails to paper the House of Parliament 3 times over, I would say, from all of us if they'd been printed out.
I'm absolutely convinced that's true,
Mm.
which is why at the beginning I suggested having a range of different tactics that you'd employ and don't just rely on sending emails to MPs or ministers. There's a role for them,
Yeah,
but it's not the only tool in the toolbox, as they
yeah.
say.
And on to tools then. Two of the things that are used quite a lot in the movement around sexual orientation, sex, gender identity, women's rights, is the thing of letters that are automatically formatted by somebody else, and you just fill your name at the bottom. I mean, do they have any impact?
Yes, but marginally. They usually have most impact on an issue like assisted dying, where there's efforts by one side and the other to mobilize opinion. And I regard those as like an online petition, which is directed at an MP's office. And I've must have filled in hundreds through the years of
Mm.
myself when I'm aggrieved about a particular issue. But when I'm typing my name and my email address and my postcode, I'm fully aware that it's not really going to shift the dial that much. But
Okay.
it makes me feel good, and it may encourage an MP to say, well, the balance of my, it may confirm the existing prejudice of an MP,
Mm.
and allow them to do something that they might not would otherwise feel brave enough to do.
And that was the other thing, was to mention the parliamentary petitions, the get over 10,000, 100,000, whatever, and there is a debate, which we did manage to get on this topic, even though it was both sides. So it did allow the issue to be aired, but there's a lot of effort goes into those. Is that wasted effort?
I love those petitions when you can be guaranteed to get a good response. If you're only going to get 212 people, don't do it.
Right.
So you need to really make a judgment of, use it when it's a success. Don't use it when it's going to be a damp squib, and you have to make that judgment call at the beginning.
Okay, so we can lose the slides now, Di. I'm going to go over to questions, but whilst I'm looking at them, can you talk to us a little bit about actually having a lobby? So we
As in
don't,
a parliamentary lobby.
yes.
So
So we don't
yeah, I've organized over the
just 1 minute.
years.
We don't need any slides at all, Di. Just me and George now on the screen. That's it. Okay,
There
so
we go.
how does a
Yeah,
lobby
over
work?
over
Yeah.
the years, I've used parliamentary lobbies and campaigns.
And
And
can you explain what one is? Because I don't know that
okay,
everybody. Yeah.
it's where you book a room in the House of Commons and for an hour, and you invite people from all around the UK to come to the House of Commons and to lobby on a particular issue. And what usually happens is that you have an anchor event, so you have an hour-long meeting, and you get a friendly MP to book the room for you. Then you invite along a few MPs to speak. I usually like to make these things cross-party, so Tory, Liberal, Lib Dem, whoever is aligned with you, get them to speak. But that's the anchor event that brings everybody together. Separately, I certainly would encourage every one of the attendees at the event, say you've got 100 people in the room, to individually put in a request to have a cup of tea or a chat with their own member of parliament on the particular issue. And that can be very successful. And people are a bit nervous about that. To help them, you maybe do a one-pager with key talking points of the key messages that you're trying to communicate. That isn't, again, the silver bullet. It might be part of a wider campaign to try and put pressure on the government. That's often used if you're trying to change a law, or I've used it in terms of changing to get a regulatory change. It's less used in terms of kind of building a reputation or building awareness. Another option you may consider, short of a lobby, is a drop-in session. And I've seen that that's where you book a room for 2 hours and you write to lots of MPs and you invite the MPs to just pop in and say hello between 10 a.m. and 12 noon and say you're there to take any questions. And that can be very successful too, because MPs may not commit to coming for an hour to your event or even for a cup of tea, but they may want to just drop in. And again, if you've got good collateral, good kind of posters or something that you might commission, and MPs can get their pictures taken and put them on social media to say
Okay.
I'm in solidarity with lesbian Labour or whatever it may be.
So just to remind people that that's the formal part of the presentation over. We've got time for some questions, so feel free to put them in the chat. I'll carry on grilling George whilst you're thinking what you might want to know. There's one here about what's the best way to engage with the opposition parliamentarians and what can you actually ask them to do?
Oh, I love working with opposition MPs, and I'll tell you why. It's because when they're in opposition, they tend to have one member of staff, you know, doing policy, and then they might have one member of staff in the constituency. So they're so short of resources. So you want to befriend the MP, get on their side, get an affinity, and then you can offer to help them. You can provide a briefing for them. I've written speeches for opposition spokespeople who then take the speech and they go, right, I'm going to read it out in Parliament. There's a debate on something, and they read out your 5-minute speech, and it's all written by you. I've worked with MPs on bill committee, what's called the bill committee, and they don't have time to to write all the amendments. And on one famous occasion with a very controversial and big bill, my company wrote over 100 amendments, and the MP just tabled every single one of them. Now, not they're not all going to get carried, but if you can develop that rapport with an MP and offer to help them, excuse me, do their job, it can be very effective. And the other thing I would say is the best time to engage with MPs is when they're at their lowest. So some of my clients say, "Oh, I'm not bothering going to Tory conference last year, because or this year, yeah, last year, 24, because they lost the election and they're irrelevant." I said, "No, now's the time to go to Tory conference. Everybody, they feel as if everybody hates them. Show them some love. Think about it as building a relationship for the long term. These people could be in government again in 5 years. Don't forget the Tories, don't forget the Liberals, don't forget the SNP. Absolutely vital."
Okay, so there's one here from Laura. How do you think effective lobbying techniques has changed over time, and what has changed in recent years in terms of the ways to reach MPs and ministers? And given that civil servants change roles so often, what's the best way to ensure you're in touch with the right ones?
Okay, how have things changed?
Mm.
Before I came into the industry, when I was when I was a special advisor, um, I think there was a perception that lobbying was about who you know. You kind of, if we know the right people, we have a quiet word, the old-fashioned have a quiet word and get something done. A bit like yes, minister type thing. Well, it's completely changed. It's very professional now, and it's professional in the way that I've outlined. Have an aim, have a strategy, have a plan, get the messaging, get the engagement right, adapt as you go on, build the coalitions. So it's a very kind of it is a discipline, and I'm very proud to have been a lobbyist. I want to say that because good lobbying means good decisions by government. And if you don't lobby, if you let the people in Stonewall have all the space and you don't fill that space, then you get really bad decisions. So you need to fix these things, and therefore you need effective lobbying. So that's how it's changed. It's much more professional than it used to be. And I'm so sorry, I forgot the second part of the
That's
question.
okay. So what has changed in recent years in terms of ways of reaching MPs and ministers? And you've answered that. The second bit was given that civil
Civil
servants,
servants, yeah.
yeah.
This is it's a long, hard slog. It's like a marathon and it's painful. And it frustrates me and it frustrates clients. But so ministers change. You got to reshuffle, civil servants change. You just need to keep working hard at it and build the links with the new folk. It's all you can do. There's no other way around it. But sometimes, though, and one of the clients I'm working with at the moment, the head of the issue, has been there for 10 years. So sometimes civil servants do stay and they do have that institutional memory. So it's not all bad news.
And how do you ensure that you're in touch with the right ones? Is that back to your stakeholder mapping, getting that right in the first
Yeah, and
place?
it's about building the links and reaching out. Ask for a meeting. A lot of my, it's just my internet's unstable. Hopefully it's gone away again. You just got to stick at it, um, and build the links and establish your credibility. You've got to be useful for them. When the
Mm.
civil servant emailed me today, he wanted me to, or my client, to do something to make his job easier. They're trying to do something, and we can help them achieve their objectives.
Mm.
And don't be scared of speaking to civil servants. Um, because they're happy to talk to stakeholders.
Well, I don't think it's that's the problem, knowing that there's a lot of women here who won't wished at all. So
Yeah,
we all know what we want to say. It's making sure that you're saying it to the right one. And then, I mean, the nugget in here for me is this knowledge about the civil service yearbook. It's the fact that addresses exist and they are somewhere
yeah, and
because
sorry, but there are other sources too. This is not a
yeah,
part, it's not an advert for Civil Service Yearbook, but
no,
there's
but
other sources that Dodds and de Havilland have similar lists.
Dodds and Haviland, go on,
De
Nisi.
Havilland, yeah, de Havilland, but they're more expensive.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Okay. Um, yes, okay, that's Helen's got to go. But yeah, just going, I hope that answered your question, Laura. I just want to go back to when you were saying about book a room for 2 hours, book a room, how do you book a room?
good question. Will you befriend a member of parliament? So, and then you contact the member of parliament and probably the researcher, because you want to befriend the researcher.
Mhm.
And you say, will you book a room for us? So one of my clients is having a parliamentary reception in the House of Commons in November this year. So in January, we contacted a friendly MP and said, would the MP be prepared to book a room in the House of Commons for us? They said, let me check with the MP, but we can't anticipate any problems. Uh, the word we got back was yes. When, where? Then the MP books the room, and then we do everything from thereafter,
Okay.
including
Um,
paying the bills.
do you think there's any value in having drop-ins where you have constituents attending that MPs can meet?
Um, Drop-ins aren't usually used for that purpose, but can be used for that purpose. If you've got a lot of people coming from across the UK, then you tend to go for the more lobby format rather than a drop-in format. A drop-in is where you might have, I don't know, it might be a particular day, and MPs can. You must have seen these pictures on social media. It's like Cancer Awareness Day or something, and the MP pops in and holds a placard and gets their photo taken.
Yeah.
It's more of a quick way to engage with MPs. It's also useful as a fishing exercise. So, for example, if you have a drop-in session and you only get 10 people coming, but 8 of those people weren't on your radar before as potential allies, that is a huge success,
Yeah.
because all you need
Right.
is a small handful of MPs to be on your side. So you can do all of the things I talked about, like booking rooms and asking parliamentary questions and getting organised in Parliament. So
Right.
don't be disappointed if you only get a few.
Okay, and there's one last question here. You mentioned having achievable asks for MPs. Do you have any examples or suggestions of realistic and achievable asks that may not be obvious to those of us not experienced in lobbying? So come up with an ask for us around the sex and
Okay.
gender thing.
Well, there's 2 kinds of asks when I talk about an ask. One is a policy ask, and the second is a organizational ask. The organizational asks are easier to talk about because I would say 95% of the meetings I've ever done with MPs, and I've done so many, they always say at the end of the meeting, "Oh, if you would like me to table any parliamentary questions, if you just fire them across and I'll have a look at them." So you should be coming armed with some parliamentary questions that they could potentially ask. And most of them would be quite happy to do that. Or MPs can initiate short debates in Parliament on policy issues. So, for example, if you have a great meeting with an MP, you could say, would you be prepared to have sorry for the jargon, a 30-minute Westminster Hall adjournment debate on gender identity issues?
Right.
You say, that's a really good idea. Let's explore that further. Could you do me a briefing on that? And then you do a briefing. And then if they get the debate, my company used to write the speeches for the MPs. So, or my clients would write the speeches for the MPs, and the MPs, of course, they give their own speeches. So that's a kind of organizational ask. On a policy ask, you need to think very carefully. In terms of the sex and gender issue, is it an education issue? Is it a health issue? Or is it an equalities issue? It's hard to be precise in the ask
Yeah.
without knowing the true context. So I've kind of swerved that question
Okay.
slightly, but
Right.
you get my drift.
Right. Well, I'm aware it's 8 o'clock and
Mm.
I've been keeping to time here. You have moved through perfectly, George. Everyone hit the right time. So I don't know about anybody else, but I want to be able to speak to George forever to get loads of stuff sorted out. And we are now going to be referring to George as our lobby doctor. And he's very kindly giving us his email address, which will be coming up during the last slide, and is willing to take your questions and just, whatever, because I know there's a whole variety of activists listening to this. We've got everything from, there we go, GG McGregor 1@gmail.com. We've got everything from somebody that's doing stuff for Sri Lanka. Obviously, WRN, there's a lot of you here. There's LGB Alliance, there's a load of you here as well. There's somebody studying social policy on the call. So I feel very proud to have given you George McGregor because he's a find, as you know. We will organise more if you want more, okay? And what we're doing now, we're just going to finish with a little film clip, which is the fact that we have all been doing this for some time now, and enjoy it.
We are winning, loving, winning, and that makes us lesbians. Lesbian, lesbian, lesbian. We are strong and we're determined and we know how to have fun. Lesbian, lesbian, lesbian. The double-headed axe is the symbol of our power. Lesbian, as one, shoulder to shoulder and friend to friend.